everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, The Bell Tolls in Cosmopolis. Hello there. We've got a couple of stories tonight. One that dates back in history of Cosmopolis and a reminiscence of what was once one of Hoquiam's proudest landmarks, a place with its rare history. We'll spin the Cosmopolis yarn first, and we'll bet that a lot of you old-timers over Cosmopolis way will recall the day that the fire bell mysteriously tolled, and the town turned out for what appeared to be a major emergency, only to discover that, well, that's getting ahead of the story. But right here, as is custom, we return the microphone to the man behind the glass screen, Dick Crombie, who can say the customary few words from our sponsor. It was the year 1916, and the day October 4th. It was a pleasant day as Octobers go, crisp, bright, and under the warm sun. The little town went about its business on schedule. Over that, the old commercial company. The saws whirled and the sawdust flew as the big plant increased its cut and kept up with the orders resulting from increased demand for lumber. The war in Europe was now 2 years old, and everyone wanted lumber. Along First Street, it was business as usual. Doc Sizer, driving down First Street on a call, waved at Fred Bissell. George DeWitt leaned in the doorway of his barber shop and watched Nelson Stedman's drive moving slowly down the street. Yes, it was a good day. You could have asked anyone on the street, and they would have agreed wholeheartedly. And then, over the business-like hum of the saws at the commercial company came the clang of a bell. Not just any bell. It was unmistakably the clang of the bell in Cosmopolis that was guaranteed to turn out every citizen for action. It was the clang of the fire bell in the city tower. Now, residents of Cosmopolis don't have to be told this. If they lived there in these days before the modern siren was purchased to sound the town's alarm and warn of its critical moments, they will recall that the bell did. It rang over years as it heralded the town's greatest moments. It sounded to end wars, peal the exuberance of the football victory. It clanged on Halloween and when disaster stalked the town. It not infrequently clanged on lodge nights after a gay young blades of the town had closed the ritual book and stopped at George Webster's saloon on the way home. Sometimes it rang out good news, sometimes bad news, sometimes no news. But when that old Cosmopolis city bell clanged in the wee hours of the night, it had a throb and a reverberation that carried across the flats of the city like no other sound on earth. To its listeners, it brought chills that raced up and down the spine, sudden wakefulness, the desire to bury their head under their pillow, yet the fear of the specular crisis that stalked the town. And now, in the middle of a peaceful morning, suddenly, the beleged began to clang, yes, and frantically. Along First Street, the town's businessmen raced to their doors and looked across the street at the bell tower that stood behind the city hall. They looked at each other and went into the street to eye the sky. There was no smoke, but the bell continued clanging furiously. Now the men were leaving their machines at the commercial company. The yard men, the tally men, came to the gates of the big compound. Throughout the town there was a brief moment of indecision. Was it a prank or was it a real thing? They were asking themselves. The frantic clanging of the bell left no doubt in their minds as the first one and then another broke into a run for a horse cart in the shed at the foot of the tower, and the rest followed. Like ants to the defense of an anthill, the citizens of Cosmopolis flocked to the bell tower. But when they arrived, the bell was silent. Not only was the bell silent, but there was no one there that could possibly have rung the bell. As more and more breathless runners pulled up at the horse cart shed, they received no answer to their shouted question, "Where's the fire?" There was confusion, blank staring confusion, but they rolled out the horse cart, unlimbered the traces, and stood by. There was no one to say, "Follow me," no one to shout directions to the disaster, no one to explain the frantic clanging. There was just no one. That is, there was no one unless you wanted to count little Mike Pappas, the 3-year-old son of Jim Pappas who operated the Index Cafe. But little Mike, anyone could tell you at a glance, couldn't have even reached the bell rope, let alone give the bell a ferocious clang. Mayor Tom Griffith surveyed the situation. He had left his job at the commercial plant and let a crew out of the yard. Now he wanted an answer, if for no other reason than to serve as an explanation to Neil Cooney and the front office if they should want an account for the precise minutes that they were off work. Mayor Tom looked up one street and down the other. There was no sign of smoke. There was no running fingers gesturing for aid. There was no sound of any commotion. Cosmopolis drowsied in that October sun, and the crowd grew larger. Housewives were mingling with the volunteers now, their aprons folded back. And to every answer, "What is it?" there was the same unsatisfactory answer, "We don't know." Well, when nothing turned up, most of the crowd began to drift back to their stores and jobs at the mill, but a few of the volunteers stayed behind, Tom Griffith dutifully amongst them. They rolled up the traces, shoved the horse carts back into the stalls, and kept one ear alert for a cry for aid, but it didn't come. Finally, Tom took head of the only citizen of the town who had been on hand when the first volunteers raced up. He turned to little Mike. "Did you see someone around here before we came?" he asked, in the most fatherly tone. "Nope," advised Mike. Tom stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Were you here when the bell rang?" he asked. The 3-year-old nodded. Now Tom had a clue. "Who was it?" he asked quickly. "Me," came back the answer. "You?" roared Tom. And with the sudden disclosure, the lower lip of young Mike trembled. "Why, you can't even reach the bell rope," the mayor almost shouted. And now Mike began to weep, big salty tears. Mayor Tom shoved his hat onto his back of his head. First, he felt like an oversized bully crouching before the trembling 3-year-old. It was uncomfortable. Secondly, he still couldn't believe that he had the answer to the town's perplexity. With a big fatherly arm, he gathered little Mike and sat him on his knee. "Now let's not cry about it," he began, and as the remaining volunteer gathered around, he soothed the small boy's anguish. And when he could talk, little Mike told the story. He related each detail with a boyish simplicity. "I wanted to know what the rope was for," Mike said. "Nobody would tell me, so I got that box over there and stood on it. But the box fell over, and I hung onto the rope and went up and down." Now Tom understood the frantic clanging. He could see the tiny lad swinging wildly at the end of the rope, his feet off the ground, going up and down with the bell rope in what was no doubt mortal terror. You wanted to see what the rope was for, and now the mayor laughed, just a chuckle at first, then a great roaring belly laugh that was taken up by a handful of citizens who had gathered around. Everyone laughed, and then the group broke up and started back to their unfinished morning business. That is, everyone but Mike and the mayor. They walked across the street to Dan Spiegel's pharmacy, where the mayor bought a small box of candy and presented it to Mike. "So you wanted to find out what the rope was for?" He could still chuckle. "I did," Mike replied. "I found out." "You sure did, laddie," the mayor came back. "And it was a fine drill for us, and it didn't hurt a thing. And he thrust the box of candy into Mike's hands, patted him on the head, and Cosmopolis officially returned to normal. Kate Stewart chased a fly out of the window of the restaurant. Joe Milliner hammered on the soles of shoes in his shop on E Street, chuckled to himself. Louis Seuss, patching a pair of trousers in his tailor shop, snipped a thread with his sharp teeth and muttered, "Kids." And the Index Cafe, Jim Pappas shook his big finger at small Mike. "The next time," he threatened. "The next time." Well, that was it. And now, Dick, it's your turn for a few words from our sponsor. We told you one night about the Grand Theatre in Aberdeen, where most of the famous artists of the earliest 20th century performed before the footlights. As I recall, there was a deluge of telephone calls afterwards, as each of the old-timers recalled one or more famous stars who played those boards, and I failed to mention. But I had mentioned them all. The story of the old Grand would have turned into a recitation of theatrical names. Anyhow, this is a brief word about another famous opera house of those days. It goes back a long time before the old Grand. We're going to talk about the old Hoquiam Opera House that once stood on the corner of 6th and K Street, southwest corner, that is, in Hoquiam. Though never as fine a theater as the old Grand, it was still the senior show house by many years, and its cracking stage echoed to many with famous voices chanting out the stark dramas of the mellow era. It was back in 1889 that Harry Livermore, who had a flair for the theatrical and a great love for the stage, organized a stock company and announced that Hoquiam was to have the finest theater on Grays Harbor. Hoquiam was not yet an incorporated city when the stockholders met and planned the venture. George Emerson, the community industrialist, was a principal supporter of the venture, and had the funds were soon raised to erect the Hoquiam Theater, as it was to be called. It was opened May 1890, with one of the Pacific Coast's favorite actresses heading the bill, Nellie McHenry. And that opening show played for 2 nights at a packed house that saw showgoers in attendance from Aberdeen, Acosta, Grays Harbor City, and points in between. It was more than a theatrical event. It was a social event of the spring. During the gay 90s, it was Hoquiam's leading show house, and the road productions that came to the Acme Opera House in Aberdeen did another one-night stand at the Hoquiam. Medicine shows, promoters, amateur theater, community benefits also played the old theater, whose stage was managed and whose politics set by manager Livermore. But like most of those ventures, it was boomed before its time, and no fire came to take it out of its troubles, such as that visited the Acme Opera House in Aberdeen. So it was passed along from one owner to another owner. George Emerson finally took it over, retaining Livermore to operate it. Around the turn of the century, F.G. Foster leased the structure, and still Harry Livermore stayed on as a part of the theater, as he had been when it was only a grand dream. It was remodeled in 1904, but when the Grand Theater was built, the bigger productions to play the harbor were seen on the stage at the newer and finer playhouse, and slowly the Hoquiam Theater dropped behind and became quiet, and an unused monument in the town's early ambitions. And in the fall of 1916, it gave way to the Wreckers' Ball and bowed out for the last time, and another landmark disappeared from the local scene, and the old-timers will recall as important indeed to the early Grays Harbor, and one that deserves to be mentioned and remembered tonight in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.